Today at the rabbit hole, I'll be showing you how to make buttercream. This is a highly requested video that's been asked so many times from lots of different people, and there are lots of things that can go wrong with buttercream, but once you've mastered it, with this guide that I'll be giving with you today, I'll be sharing the recipe, tips, tricks, flavour variations, troubleshooting, answer your questions and a lot more. You'll be able to make super easy and great buttercream, and once you've mastered that, you can use for cakes, cupcakes, literally anything. It's a baking basic. First up, what equipment do you need to make buttercream? Now, you don't need advanced tools or anything like that, but you need a bowl to obviously mix, one that won't break that easily, a spatula, a sort of spoon, measuring spoons like tablespoon, teaspoons, a sieve, and you can use a electric whisk or a stand mixer, which is even better. Next up, ingredients. Now, these don't need to be really expensive. Obviously, the better quality, the better buttercream. But you'll need icing sugar. You can use flavoured icing sugar or plain, 500 grams of that, and butter. I use a stalk block, which happens to be vegan, so I use that for all of my cakes. 250 grams of that. So as you'll see, it's a 2-to-1 ratio of sugar to butter. Then you will need some vanilla essence or other flavouring and some plant-based milk or normal milk of your choice. How to make buttercream. Follow this recipe as much as you can, and then once you've got the hang of it, you can adjust it. So open up your butter and put this in the microwave if you need to for 10 seconds on either side till it's soft. This is only if it's just come out of the fridge, or just leave it out till you need to use it. Remember, use softened butter. Do not melt your butter. That is not how the buttercream will work. So use a electric whisk. I don't recommend doing it by hand. And keep whipping it for 1 minute to kind of make it a bit more fluffier. Then add in a teaspoon of vanilla essence or other flavouring that you'd like. This is basic vanilla buttercream, so I'm just using vanilla. And the key thing here is to whip it for 4 minutes straight. Just keep whipping it and use a spatula to scrape down the edges and kind of combine it together. The more you whip it, the better. You can't really whip it too much in this, and you'll see that the more you whip it, eventually the buttercream will become a lot more lighter. It will be pale, it will be fluffy, and you'll be able to see that quite visually. Once you've done that, you're going to add in your icing sugar in bits. I'm going to add half at a time. Sift this in because you want to avoid any lumps. If you're just using this to cover a cake, it's alright if you don't sift it sometimes, but I recommend you do, because if you're ever piping, sometimes large clumps of sugar can get trapped in the nozzle, and that can get super annoying when you're trying to pipe. So I'd recommend you always try and sift your icing sugar. Use a spatula to kind of combine it with the butter, not all the way, but enough so when you start putting the electric whisk, the sugar does not fly out everywhere and make a mess, because I'm guilty of that a lot. So just use a spatula to combine it, and then bring in the electric whisk and whisk it properly till combined. Once you've done that, add in your second half of icing sugar and do the same thing repeatedly. Try not to make a massive mess with the icing sugar, because it does fly everywhere. With chocolate icing, you can either melt chocolate and then whisk it in at the end, or you can replace some of the icing sugar with cocoa powder, obviously not a lot. Add a tablespoon of milk if you're leaving your icing like this, white, or if you're making chocolate icing, because it will be a lot more thicker. You don't have to add this milk. I don't always add it, but just add enough so it's the correct consistency of icing that you need. If it's too runny, then add more icing sugar. If it's too thick, then add more milk. I do not suggest you add milk if you're going to colour your buttercream, which there is a high chance you might do, because the food colouring is obviously either, if you're using liquid, then it will make the buttercream more softer than it already is, and you don't want it to be too runny. So after you've finalised your icing, you've added any other flavouring and any other essences or colouring, then add your milk if you need it to reach the right consistency. How to pipe a simple swirl of your buttercream. I'll be doing more videos on piping techniques, but this is just a little glimpse into it. So once you've coloured your icing and then put it into a nozzle, start on the outside, apply even pressure and go all the way around to reach the centre, squeeze and let go, and that's done. You can try all sorts of different variations with this, but we explore that in another video. Buttercream do's and don'ts. What to do? Whip for at least 5 minutes, because whipping is a key part of buttercream. If you kind of take the shortcut and do maybe 1 minute or something, it might work for you, but I don't suggest it because the buttercream can split or not be the right consistency. Use room temperature butter for the best results. You don't want it to be too soft or too hard, because that will affect your whisking. Do sift your icing sugar. It creates more smoother buttercream. You don't want lumps in it. Color your icing sugar with gel food coloring is most recommended. However, you can use liquid, but be careful that your icing does not get too runny. Keep it in a cool environment. You don't want it to keep it hot because then of course the icing will get quite soft and runny. Don't get me wrong, once you've got used to it, you can take shortcuts in ways where you know that it will still work out. But at this stage, I do not recommend you do. You don't want to skip steps or try and speed up the whipping process because it will affect the buttercream and you don't want to be disappointed with it. Do not add too much liquid to your buttercream because then you have to keep adding icing sugar and that will make your icing in the end a lot more sweeter. I suggest using gel food coloring. However, if you don't, of course, you can use liquid food coloring. I tend to use that all the time, but be careful with not making it too runny, so use concentrated ones. I've seen people do this, but you cannot whip melted butter. It just doesn't work. It will not be light and fluffy because it's a liquid that you're trying to whip into that. So you're allowed to put it in the microwave to melt it. Not melt it, let it soften, but do not completely melt it. Do not use margarine. I have tried. I failed so many times before I managed to get my buttercreams correct. It does not work and it has a different proportion of fats. Don't use non-room temperature butter, so make sure it's at room temperature, it's soft. If you put your finger in it, it should make an indent because you don't want your buttercream splitting or becoming too hard and cracking or having air bubbles and things like that. Over whisking is harder to do with this kind of buttercream, but you don't want to whisk it too much, otherwise it will cause air bubbles in your buttercream, which you do not want to make it smooth. Once you've mastered how to make buttercream, you can add your own flavour variations to it depending on your cake. So in general areas, if you want to make a fruity flavoured buttercream, add the essence and the puree if you'd like to. However, that might change the colour. So let's say if you're making strawberry icing, add strawberry essence, and if you'd like to, strawberry puree and pink food colouring if you want to enhance like the colours of it. The Biscoff and Nutella flavoured, you just add the spread as much as you want depending on how strong you want the flavours to be. I suggest adding maybe around a quarter cup of the spread and then add a splash of milk to help it combine properly as well. If you want any specific flavours, comment them below, or if you need any extra support on any of these flavours, and I can give you the proper measurements that I'd recommend for them and any tips, tricks or other flavour options as well. So just comment below and I'll answer any questions that you have about other flavours. Next, I'll be answering frequently asked questions and troubleshooting points. If your icing is too crumbly, just add roughly a tablespoon of milk and mix it till it has become smooth and come together. That's kind of the basics of what to do. If your icing is too thick, then add milk or a liquid. However, only do this after you've coloured your buttercream if you are doing that, because obviously your food colouring will change the consistency of your icing too. If your icing is too stiff, that's what you do. If your icing is too soft to pipe, that may be to do with the butter that you're using. For example, margarine has more of like a higher water ratio than butter with less fat, so it won't hold the structure of the icing as well. So try and experiment with different butters to see what works best. To be honest, I don't find it to be a massive problem for me. I use a stalk block, but you can use any butter, vegan as well. Don't use margarine though, because margarine does not work. I have been through that a lot. If your icing is too runny, then add more icing sugar or something thick to keep its consistency, or ideally you can use it or keep it in the fridge for around 10 minutes before you're actually using it, but don't rely on the fridge too much, only a bit, because of course when you pipe it and bring it back to room temperature, it will kind of lose its consistency again as well. So you can keep it in the fridge for a bit, but also add more icing sugar to stiffen it up. Buttercream can be glossy, like you can see in the video right now. That depends on the temperature of your butter. Now, obviously glossy icing may look nice sometimes, but that's not what you really want for icing to be. You want it to be more of a matte kind of appearance. So that could be to do with the butter temperature, which is very key. If your butter is too warm, it can kind of melt on the surface. That might make it quite shiny, which isn't really what you need, and that can also cause it to split. So you want to use room temperature butter all the time. If your butter is too cold, then your icing might curdle or start splitting, which looks really odd as well. So you don't want that to happen. With that, bring it back to room temperature, give it a good whisk with some icing sugar and see if it remains like that. If not, add more milk or add more icing sugar. So be careful with the temperature of your butter. When you've gone shopping for icing sugar, you may have seen that some are called powdered sugar, some are called confectioner's sugar, some are called icing sugar, or even if you're looking online for other recipes. However, they are all the same thing. They're just names for sugar crystals that are being ground to a fine powder, which is what we're using. Even though it's fine, make sure you sift it because you don't want lumps, especially if it's been lying in the cupboard for a long time. You'll see that there are lumps forming at the top. So sift that. They're all the same thing, so you can use any of them for your icing sugar. I understand the urge when you've got your sponges, you've got your buttercream and you want to start decorating. However, the main thing with baking is patience, and you're going to have to wait till your cake is at room temperature. If your cake is hot and you try and pipe on it or put icing on it, it is going to start melting or start splitting because the temperatures are too different. So you always want a cooled down cake. I generally tend to leave my cakes overnight wrapped in cling film, so the next day everything's at room temperature. I have everything I need ready to start stacking and decorating. How to store icing. If you're using it for the next day or something, you can wrap it in cling film and leave it outside as long as it's not too hot or too cold in the room that you're in. If you're using it for a couple of days later, you can store it in the fridge, but you do not want the icing to have that fridge taste, so make sure it's sealed in an airtight container. You can even make icing in a large batch and leave it for even a month later. This is quite handy as once you defrost it, you can just defrost your buttercream, just put it in the microwave for like 30-second bursts and keep stirring until it's reached the consistency that you need it, or just leave it out overnight for it to kind of settle to room temperature itself. This is really handy when you've made a batch of buttercream, just kept it in the freezer, and you can just take it out, defrost a scoop for however many cupcakes or cakes that you need to decorate it with. So thank you so much for watching. That's all from me for this video. I've covered my buttercream recipe, tips, tricks, how to pipe, troubleshooting, and frequently asked questions. However, if you have any more questions, concerns, problems, or issues with your buttercream when you're trying to make it, just comment them below and I'll try and answer them as best as I can to help you achieve your best buttercream. This is Buttercream Basics, what you need for baking. Once you've mastered this, decorating becomes so much more easier. Stay tuned because I have more videos coming up, including piping techniques and more.